but you also interpret it. This isn't just gazing at nature, this is interpreting and feeling nature. Now the first thing we're going to look at is the romantic idea of nature. And this is something you learned about in your textbooks. This was a particular series of ideas that arose in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was called the Romantic period. Before we show you the pictures, let's write down some of the ideas. The Romantic idea of landscape was that it was very humble and simple. These are words I've taken from your textbooks, so you may already have them. In Europe, people left the cities and went out and walked in the hills and talked to farmers and talked to people who lived with the sheep. And they felt that these people were much more real. They were less artificial than people in the city. They also felt that nature was a place that contained feeling, that it was a real living part of their lives. It wasn't separate from them. It was also a place of the mind where you could gaze upon nature and experience what your book calls the sublime. You may remember this word. The sublime means that you stand and you look at nature and your feelings are so excited that all you feel is astonishment. You can't even speak, it's so magnificent. At the same time, you like nature to be slightly desolate, slightly frightened, but not to the point where it can kill you, but it gives you a kind of negative excitement. It makes you feel something. Now, how did artists show us this in paintings? Well, perhaps the most famous is a German artist named Caspar David Friedrich. And the first picture we see of his comes from the early 19th century. Here we see two civilized Europeans standing in their cloaks, and what they're doing, unlike they do in Canada, they're looking at a beautiful sunset, they're looking at the ocean, and here the words serene and quiet and peaceful is the romantic idea. That nature brings you rest and feeling. The second one is very romantic. Here we see the sublime. We see the European man. And notice he has his cane, he has his overcoat on. How he climbed up to that little mountain peak, we don't know. But this is not a man who carries his paints in a backpack and doesn't climb with a canoe and doesn't have to bring a rifle to shoot wild animals. This is a man who's climbed up almost as if he's in heaven. You can see the clouds, the beautiful swirling light, the huge, glorious mountains in the background. Here in this picture, the European mind views the landscape as something astonishing, as if it is something that comes directly from the voice of God. This is not the same landscapes that we've been looking at. Finally, the same painter, Caspar David Friedrich, gives us a romantic vision of desolation. Now, to a Canadian looking at this picture, we find this rather strange, because this is supposed to be ice. But no ice that you ever see in Canada looks like this. And in fact, it is very clear that Caspar David Friedrich never saw real ice. What he's painted is a romantic interpretation of it. As Piero said, if you notice in the picture, we have a ship that has been lost in the storm, and that these great pieces of ice are not ice as much as they are like tombstones made of stone. You'll notice way in the background we have these enormous sublime towers. This shows us the glory and the beauty and the power of nature, but it doesn't in any way express the same kind of power that we see in the Canadian landscape. Now, contrast this romantic vision of the European mind, and we go into the Canadian mind, and we see an entirely different type of landscape. We see a huge, clear distance, no, very small. We see lakes, we see barren islands, and this is because the group of 7 wanted to show Canada as a pure landscape. It was a pure, unspoiled place. Only animals lived there. Human beings did not live there for the most part. And as many of you said in your commentaries, this was peaceful, this was isolated, this gave you a sense of being alone. Second picture, once again, here is Frederick Varley, who is painting the mountains, but he, following in the tradition of the group of 7, wanted landscape, but to look at him as a painter, because one of the ways that the group of 7 said, look at Canada, is say, we want to show you that we are real artists. We are not amateurs. We know how to use brush strokes. We know how to create impressions following the lessons we've learned from the masters that we have seen in museums and in exhibitions. Finally, we have a picture, another one by Fred Varley, and this is a nationalistic picture. This is a picture of a place that only exists in Canada. It's called Lake O'Hara. It's in the Rocky Mountains. And the group of 7 purposely went out to famous landscape places in the country and painted them, interpreted them to say, we have our own identity. We are a nation unto ourselves. We are not England. We are not the United States. We are Canada. So this picture not only describes the landscape, but it also expresses Canadian nationalism. And it was a very specific part of how the group of 7 looked at their art. Now finally, we are going to look at some rather frightening pictures. And this is what Margaret Atwood tended to look at. There she is again. You can see her famous eyes. 7 and Canadian art in a number of different ways. She is a social critic, so she says, nature is not only frightening and menacing, but nature is sometimes, and even our art about nature, has been reduced to decoration. It is commercialized into saleable images. Here we have Tom Thompson's famous painting that is put up in a restaurant and a bar. People who come into this bar will know the picture right away. Now, it could be a picture that's a poster, it could be a projection, but it has been a commercialized interpretation of this. Secondly, we see often on public buildings, people will put out pictures. Now, this picture itself in real life is only this big. But it's exploited. Probably it sells Canadian clothing. It might sell Canadian maple leaf sugar. Anything. It's a commercialization of the art. So she's saying landscape very frequently is made into something trivial and commercial and banal. Third one we see how Canadian pictures are turned into postage stamps. Here is a picture you've already seen. This is Tom Thompson's famous pine. Now this was done as a celebration of the artist, but at the same time, it's the same impulse where you will see pictures of Piero della Francesca on aprons and on pajamas and on playing cards. It's the same idea of turning art, and in this case the landscape, into something that's kitsch and commercial. Finally, we see some very frightening images coming up. Here is the famous Bertinsky, the Canadian photographer. Here's the destruction of the landscape that really irritates and bothers Margaret Atwood. These are the oil spills in Alberta where they're drilling into the earth for oil, and this is the pollution that is spread over the landscape. As you can see, it's very barren. In some ways, these photographs resemble some of the landscapes that we saw earlier on. The loneliness, the coldness. But this is a result of man's destruction. And one of the things that Atwood is very much against is this kind of thing. Finally, I think we have the landscape as menacing. We see this in the story. You've seen pictures like this before, but this is not uncommon. This is out in the prairie. Suddenly a storm will appear very quickly, and you'll see the size of it. It will turn into a hurricane. It will turn into a tornado. And soon you have destruction. You have the same problem, but yours is in the ground. You have the terremoto, what do they call it? The earthquake. Finally, you can see once again a snowy. Can you imagine being lost out there? What if your car broke down? Where would you go here? Where would you find shelter? Do you know how to eat the grass that is growing there? How do you know the water hasn't been polluted by the oil wells? Can you imagine having to spend your night? You may not see it from where you're sitting, but there are little snowflakes beginning. All Canadians, when they go into the landscape, put into the trunks of their car chocolate bars, one blanket, a shovel, and 2 candles. The candles are not to light yourself, but if you sit in a cold car with a candle lit, that one candle can heat up the air and keep you from freezing to death. So this is very common. Doesn't matter where you live in Canada. Finally, here's Canada in the winter. Very menacing. But at the same time, the winter can have, in the same way that the paintings have for Lois, as we see in our final picture of the presentation today, it has a very calm, quiet, restful, perhaps a peacefulness. It's empty, but it's peaceful. I don't know, some people may react to it in a different way. This is a colored picture, by the way. It's not black and white. It's the light that brings it this way. So there you have Margaret Atwood and the landscape. We have our 3 different comparisons. We hope that this introduction to a new culture and a new way of using art you can use in your further lessons on Romanticism and when you are reading more English.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?